Hey folks, your OS reviews. So it's no secret that Nokia has produced some gorgeous and beautiful hardware through the years, and I think that the Nokia N9 and 800 shares a striking resemblance that is extremely well crafted and an iconic piece of design. So I wanted to revisit in this video a bit of a comparison between these two phones. The N9 came out first and was followed by the 800, which runs on Windows Phone operating system, as opposed to MeeGo, which is found on the N9. So let's go through some of the differences between these two phones, which are still quite popular and you can find online through third-party sellers. So starting with the hardware on the outside first, you can see that there really isn't too much of a difference between the two. You might even mistake one for the other. Of course, the Windows variant does have 3 capacitive controls on the bottom that makes the screen slightly smaller at 3.7 inches compared to the N9's 4 inches, since it uses virtual controls for swipe gestures as opposed to physical ones. The N9 also has a front-facing camera on the bottom, which is good for video chatting applications, a feature that's missing on the 800 because Windows phones at the time didn't have any front-facing cameras, meaning that Skype calls, FaceTime, all those things were missing. However, the main body of the phone is the same, from the controls to the construction quality, made out of a solid chunk of polycarbonate that feels refined, feels elegant and hefty, and despite being made out of plastic, and even if you chip the phone, the color on the inside would be the same as the outside, which was impressive. Flipping the phones over, you have access to the same 8 megapixel Carl Zeiss lens that is autofocus and the same dual LED flash, although the placement has slightly been tweaked between the two. Otherwise, the same sharp corners and the same speaker located on the bottom can be found on both versions, along with the same ports on the very top corresponding to the headphone port next to the micro SIM port, along with the micro USB port for charging. Along the sides, there were the same volume controls and the same power switches, although the 800 did have an extra key for launching the camera, which made it slightly better for photography and for instantly capturing images using the autofocus as well as recording video, a feature that was missing on the N9. So a slight edge here in terms of just having one more physical hardware key. However, I will say that the N9 does have something else that's kind of unique. If I even curve the screen kind of off to the sides, you can really notice how all the edges almost bleed onto the sides, making for a very fluid experience when you're interacting with the user interface, which is completely swipe and gesture based. That's compared to the Windows Phone version, which, although it's still slightly curved, it isn't as noticeable. It's still a very bubbly kind of glass that is not completely flush and makes for the touch sensitivity a bit more responsive, but definitely not as noticeable as the N9 when you're swiping through menus across the glass. It's a bit more flush. So that's one of the other differences between the hardware. Otherwise, they are very much identical. Otherwise, in cases designed for one, should fit the other with ease. So turning things on, you can see there are some software differences right away. From the MeeGo operating system, there's that clock that floats around, tells you the time. You can double tap to unlock, and these are very modern UI touches that are now slowly coming into prominence with mainstream operating systems like Android, for instance, whereas Windows Phone at the time required you to tap on the power key once to physically turn the phone on, and then you have to swipe up to access your features. Otherwise, again, we have access to the same type of display. Both are using AMOLED, both have the same 800 by 480 resolution, and both have 16 gigabytes of built-in flash storage. The N9 has a 1 gigahertz processor, the 800 has a 1.4 gigahertz processor, so slight differences there. Both are single core, however, and both have 512 megabytes well, the 800 has 512 megabytes of RAM, whereas the N9 has 1 gigabyte. So again, a minor difference there, but both are fairly fluid and responsive from the UI perspective. Aside from having very colorful and saturated displays, notifications are handled slightly differently. So on the N9, you could tap on this once. It's the equivalent of a drag-down notification drawer, which gives you updates with information that would be displayed down below, wireless updates in addition to profile settings. Battery status and time and date would always be located on the very top, whereas on Windows Phone version 7.5, these things were hidden. There's only a time information, so you can tap on it and drag down once to have access to your battery status and also your Wi-Fi and connectivity status, but that was it. As far as physical notifications, they can't be consolidated in this one notification area, which was one of the limitations at the time that has since been updated through newer versions of Windows Phone. So taking a look at some other main aesthetic differences, I would suppose, between, let's say, the dialer pad and between both of these phones. Both pretty simple, both oversized, easy to tap on, easy to press, but a slightly different design. N9 using, MeeGo, which has a bit more of a Linux background. It's a bit more elegant and a bit more colorful and saturated, whereas Windows Phone is coming in, after Windows Mobile is already a huge step above, but it still remains more of a productivity-centric design that has a bit more of a structured, rigid layout. So going back home is a very simple tapping on there, whereas MeeGo, of course, you slide either from any corner of the phone to exit out of an application. Multitasking is possible on both phones. On the Windows device, you would have tapped on the back key for a few seconds. Take a look at your previously opened applications to just jump on into it by tapping on it, whereas on the N9, it would be displayed on the sides here as a series of cards with your previously opened applications accessible there that you would tap on once. So both have a pretty intuitive as well as easy multitasking experience. I would say the N9 is slightly easier in a sense, but both do a decent job. Interface here for the cameras are very similar as far as features that you have because they're using the same sensors basically, 8 megapixels on both phones. So if we want to take a quick look, let's say at this one down below here, very simple Windows-based navigation system that gives you access to settings here, including scenes, filters, ISO, effects, contrast, saturation, flicker rate, all things that I can edit through, whereas Nokia gives you a bit more of settings to play around with if you are more into professional photography. So you have access to more things such as, your resolution, automatic, macro modes, scene modes, flash, red eye reduction, aspect ratios, all these things, geotagging. So it's a bit more complicated with a few more settings that you could play around with if you wanted to. But otherwise, the same sensor, so the same very good image quality can be found on both phones that performed very well for the time. Otherwise, if we press on done here and take a look at some other things and differences, obviously the web browser, both aren't the most up-to-date browsers anymore, so there's not going to be the best experience for browsing complex pages, but they still are able to render full desktop versions of sites. It'll take longer, and the RAM here on the 800 is a bit more of a crippling factor, in the sense you can see the New York Times is not going to fully load, it seems, on some occasions, but the N9 is still able to do that, although it takes a few seconds longer compared to modern-day smartphones. But let's exit out of that. In terms of navigation, very similar, since Nokia is behind both of these in terms of their app support. So you have access to Nokia Maps, Nokia Drive, so that gives you turn-by-turn navigational directions after you've downloaded certain segments of maps that you need for a certain geography, and that produces a very great GPS companion tool, a feature that wasn't found, on comparable Android phones and iOS devices at the time. So this was a leg up in that department. Applications, both very limited, but at least MeeGo came included with a few more entertainment-based apps out of the box, since again it was a relatively new operating system at the time. So they gave you access shortcuts to YouTube. There was Angry Birds that was installed. Skype was on here for video chatting. There was also access to a few other games that use the accelerometer, in addition to Twitter and Facebook. Whereas on Windows Phone it was a lot more clean in terms of the install, not a lot of bloatware. Zoom Music on here, but that's essentially it. You have to use the marketplace to download any third-party apps you want to. And of course there's still Twitter, there's still Facebook, but it's a little bit more behind as far as updates are concerned, and game selection is also quite limited. Same thing really with the MeeGo operating system, but in 2017, because Windows Phone is still alive and MeeGo is not as much alive, there's been an attempt at some revivals. The selection for Windows Phone is slightly ahead, but really not by much. So both in terms of apps, not as huge selection as Android or iOS. Otherwise, again, music players a little bit different on both. We have, with the MeeGo operating system using its own kind of interface here that gives you cover art support with song selections, and then you can go to OV Music to download more songs. That's Nokia's own system. Whereas on here, the music app was tied and integrated with the Zunes, so it's kind of taking the same design that we saw with the Zune HD and Zoom music players that Microsoft didn't find too much success with, but a very slick interface as well that gives you access to your music, videos, podcasts, radios, consolidated into this one place, and also some cover art support. Both I think are fairly elegant. The N9's implementation is a bit more simple, a bit more straightforward. So this is more of a universal hub of media in this one place. Battery life and performance, very similar on both. Both can get you about 2 to 3 days before you need to recharge it again, since they are fairly optimized. And again, there's not a huge screen, there's not a huge processor, so it doesn't really have to power a ton of internals, which is why the battery is better than most modern day phones with giant displays and full HD displays as well. So anyways, guys, this has been, I guess, a look back and a brief comparison of some of the hardware and obvious software differences between the Nokia Lumia 800 and the N9, two devices that share very similar DNA and roots that Nokia used and was quite iconic and revolutionary at the time, and paved the way for a lot of modern-day Windows phones that still share a striking resemblance to what the N9 came out with using this polycarbonate shell and one-piece design. Thanks for watching this video here at OS Reviews.